Greetings everybody, this is Sweet Beats with Sweet Beats Tech Stop, and today we're going to show you how to access and remove the system board in a Yamaha AW4416 standalone digital audio workstation. There's a well-known issue that the real-time clock integrated circuit, which is a DS12887 chip that has a clock and an integrated battery. After 15-20 years or so, the battery is depleted and you start to get a low battery warning. This is not a huge issue. It's a 24-pin dual inline package integrated circuit that's soldered to the main system board in the AW, and it's a through-hole component and can be desoldered, removed, and new parts are readily available and quite affordable. You do have to have some pretty good skills because of the way the board is constructed in terms of desoldering and soldering. So if you don't have these skills, it's recommended that you have somebody with that experience to do the actual component removal and reinstallation. And I recommend that you put a socket in, a machine pin socket, and then plug the new integrated circuit into the socket. That makes for easier removal and replacement down the road, and also avoids applying heat to the new component when soldering it in. So that's the trickiest part, but the part that you likely can do yourself, and I want to show you how, is just how to open it up and remove the system board and to do it as safely as possible. With that though, I will say proceed at your own risk. I'm not liable or responsible for any damage that occurs to your equipment or damage to yourself as a result of doing this. I'm not saying you have to do it or you should do it or it's wise for you to do it. I'm just showing you how I do it, and then you can decide what you want to do and you're responsible for yourself. But electricity can kill, so please proceed with caution. A few things that you're going to need. This device is full of surface mount microprocessing integrated circuit stuff, and it can be damaged irreparably if you don't follow proper electrostatic discharge precautions, anti-static stuff, okay? You'll also see that as ESD, electrostatic discharge. And what that means is that you can build up a static charge on your body. You can touch a component or a printed circuit board assembly in there and send what amounts to, can be up to tens of thousands of volts, very low current, but tens of thousands of volts into that board as the voltage differential between you and the component is equalized, and that can roach stuff. So I highly recommend that you not only ground yourself, but the device to a common point. This is a little kit that you can get on Amazon, and I'll put a link to it in the description. It comes with 2 cords and this special plug. This plugs into a properly grounded wall outlet, and you need to make sure that it is properly grounded, but notice that the hot and neutral prongs are just plastic, so they don't conduct anything, but the ground prong is this brass colored metal here, and that goes to these 2 4mm banana plug type connections. And then the kit provides you with a wrist strap that goes on your wrist and has this metal plate, so that's touching this fleshy part of your wrist down here. And then the other end, it comes with an alligator clip, but you can slide that off. Bear with me. You can slide that off, and then you have your banana plug, and then that plugs into one of the connections on the wall adapter, and then you have a cable with 2 alligator clips. Of course, either one of those can slide off, and revealing a 4mm plug, plug that into the other and clip the other end to your work. The other things that you will need is a Phillips screwdriver. And I recommend, if this is something that's very helpful, if you're not accustomed to disassembling stuff that has multiple screws and things like that, just get some regular Ziploc sandwich bags or any kind of baggie, even the fold top sandwich bags, and a Sharpie. And as you disassemble things, put the screws into baggies, label the baggies, use as many as you need, and group the hardware together. And also nowadays, just about everybody has one of these, you know, a cell phone with a camera. Take pictures, take lots of pictures. Take pictures of you pointing to screws that you removed, or pointing to connections that you're removing and where they go and those sorts of things. You'll find it's easier than you think. And then you may want to have just a pair of regular vinyl medical gloves. If it's warm where you're working, your hands get sweaty or that sort of thing, it's always nice just to keep the work dry and clean. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to prepare the AW, because what we're going to need to do next is to turn it over and begin removing the bottom cover. And I remove these knobs from here so they're no longer protruding. So these are the encoders for pan and EQ and other things. Those simply slide off. You can put those in a baggie, and then the next thing that you're going to need to do is have some way of keeping your AW from laying on the face of these controls. Now, I have a pair of closed cell foam blocks that I've kind of shaped to support the face, but you can also use just some rolled up towels. Okay, these will go on the table, you turn it over, and it lays on these. And that just keeps it spaced away from the controls and provides a soft surface for it to lay on. So we've got our AW4416 flipped over. You can see I've got it resting on these towels, and you can see that no controls are actually coming in contact with the work surface. And so again, that's the purpose of putting these pads down, just to protect the face and the control surface of the AW. Before we proceed, just to be clear, there are components inside that hold a charge, such as electrolytic capacitors, particularly in the power supply, which is located under here. This is the cooling fan for the power supply. And when plugged in, those can, in certain devices, remain charged, or even when unplugged, hold a charge for some time. So again, proceed at your own risk. I generally leave a device unplugged overnight before I'm working on it, or if I'm very familiar with it and know where and what to avoid contacting, etc., I may proceed, you know, when it's been recently powered, or be doing work on it while it's powered. But I'm just asking you to exercise caution in that. This particular AW has been unplugged for weeks, and so I'm reasonably certain that there's no electrical charge that's being held in there. You can see I have my ESD wrist bracelet on. I am not using the wall adapter that I demonstrated earlier, because I have both my bracelet and the ground clip for the device plugged into my test equipment here. There are 4mm banana plug sockets on some of the devices, so it's plugged into one one of the power modules that has one cord that's plugged into the grounded outlet. It's essentially the same as plugging this into your outlet. So I just wanted to make clear in case any of you were noticing, hey, I don't see it plugged into this. It's essentially the same thing I have here. The other thing I wanted to just clarify too, just in case it wasn't clear earlier, why would you take this all apart and get the system board out rather than just sending the whole AW to somebody to do the repair? You can do it that way too. I'm just presenting this educational opportunity for how you get the system board out for the Dallas RTC replacement, because it is much more costly and risky to send through shipping the entire AW to somebody. You might end up spending $100 to $150 more just in shipping if you leave it wholly assembled, and then depending on what the technician is going to charge labor for doing that disassembly. And if you can do it yourself, you could save yourself $200, maybe more, for the job. So I'm like, if you're going to send it to me, the turnaround time is also much faster if you just send the system board. But that doesn't mean that I and others aren't certainly capable of doing that disassembly. This may also help you if you have a local tech or know somebody locally that's good with a soldering iron, and you can get it out for them. They might be more willing to be like, sure, I can do that for you if you can just hand me the PCB. I'll take care of that. So that's really what this video is about, is an effort to help you save some money and maybe reduce turnaround time, etc. Also, before I proceed here, I'm going to pull my hard drive caddy out. I normally just, use a manual screwdriver, but for the sake of the video, it's going to be easier if I'm using a drill motor to remove the fasteners. And I have a magnetic tip to capture the screws, and I don't want that anywhere near my hard drive. This isn't converted to compact flash. There's a good old, magnetic hard drive on there. So probably overkill, but I just don't like messing with that. So for the bottom cover removal, the screws that need to be removed to get the bottom panel off, there are two here. You'll see I already removed one here. So 1, 2, and then there are 2 more here. There are 3 along each side. A little harder to see those. 1, 2, 3. There are these 2 on the optical drive escutcheon. This surround that goes around that. And then there is 1, 2 more along the front. You do not need to do this one or this one, or there's also one more like that that's all the way around the edge here that gets uncovered when this comes out. So just these 2, and then pull this away, and then this one and this one. You also have to remove these 4 screws and remove this access panel because this panel goes through the bottom cover to the chassis. So all of the screws we're going to remove in this step are the exact same type of screw, except these 4 are distinct. You'll notice that these are very different. They have captive flat washers and captive split lock washers, and these are machine screws. All the rest of them are a sheet metal type thread screw and are all the same. That simplifies it for you in keeping track of your parts. So we'll have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 screws that are identical for most of the bottom cover, and then these 4 for this access panel that are a set of 4. So we're gonna get right to it. Where I have this chassis ground clipped in, here's your standard IEC power connector. We have our hot and neutral prongs here, and this is the ground prong. You can tell it's different because it sticks out further, and it's the one at the bottom. for this step, I'm clipping right to that. We also have a screw here. This is a chassis ground screw, but if you open it up and look inside, this ground prong goes right over to this and then on to the rest of the internals. So this is an easier way for this step to clip and have the whole system grounded to the same potential that I am, which eliminates the electrostatic discharge risk. And also, I'm working on this finished wood surface, which is non-conductive. You can also get on Amazon, you know, ESD safe non-conductive rubber mats that you can lay down. I may need to get something like that at some point, but for now this suffices. All right, let's get to it. All right, with all the screws out, the escutcheon comes away, the access panel comes off, and now this bottom cover, which one did I forget? Oh, I forgot these two. Okay. There we go. All right, so now it just simply lifts away. So again, just lifts right off. And then what we have exposed, we have option slot 1, option slot 2. This is the hard drive bay. This is the power supply. This is your optical drive. This is the fader board. We have the input output sub CPU board here. And then right down in there, look at that little clock. So that's our target. This is the main system board here, this large one that runs all the way across. And that's what we have to get out. And the way that we're going to do that, this whole chassis is all one piece. This is a frame. You can kind of see down in here that goes all the way across in one piece. And there are 5 screws that hold this to the main chassis. We're gonna do a few things with some of these wires to make it easier to do what I'm gonna describe that we do. And we also need to have some kind of protective, non-conductive layer over this, but we're essentially going to remove those 5 screws. And you can take this entire assembly and just flip it over and lay it back here, exposing the main board and its sub-chassis. So that will be the next step. And as a related aside, this is also if you need to replace your power supply cooling fan. This is the stage where you're at the point where you can do that. You simply have to get access to the power supply, and you do that by unplugging these. No, I didn't put that one back in. Bear with me a moment. So there are 3 smaller connectors. They all have a different number of pins, so you can't, when putting this back together, you're not going to inadvertently plug the wrong thing into the wrong spot because it won't fit correctly. They each have a different number of pins. So these simply unplug, just kind of I don't know if you can see, but you kind of wiggle and pull, try and grab as many of the wires as you can so that you're not straining one particular wire, but by gently rocking back and forth and pulling upward, they come out pretty easily. And then we have our power connector to our optical drive. These connectors have a spring loaded release tab. You push down and simultaneously kind of wiggle and pull up, and that comes free. And then this one goes to the sub CPU board. Or actually no, this is for the hard drive bay. Same type as with the optical drive. And actually we could leave that one plugged in, come to think of it, because this whole chunk of stuff is going to stay together. But if you wanted to access your power supply, then the next steps are, and I'll have to double check which screws, but I believe you need to remove this screw and remove this screw, and then it slides this way. You can see there are these locking tabs down here. Once you remove any necessary screws here, because you don't need to remove the fan screws, you may need to remove these two with the power socket, and I believe definitely these two. And once you remove those, the assembly is able to slide back just enough to then lift off of those tabs, and then you can flip that over and access the fan and other internals of the power supply. It's actually the cover that comes off when you remove these screws. So yeah, I think it's this one and just this one. And these screws for the power connector and the fan can remain. But anyway, that's how you get into that. The other thing we're going to do right now is, in order to get access and get the system board out, another next step is to remove these 4 screws that hold the optical drive in place. And once those are removed, you can just slide that forward a little bit so that it is no longer hanging over the main system board and clears it, allowing that to come out later. So we're going to do that really quick as well. And by the way, these 4 screws are the same ones that you can access when the bottom cover is on, because by taking that access plate off, that allows you to disconnect the optical drive. And then there are holes in the bottom cover to be able to unscrew these. You remove the escutcheon, and then you can actually remove the whole drive without removing the bottom cover. But we've got the bottom cover off anyway. We're just going to pull these off now. Okay, and then we can just kind of slide that forward. There is an IDE connector that's here on the motherboard, just like on a older computer that had IDE protocol. It would be familiar. That goes from the main board to the IDE hard drive bay and over to our IDE optical drive. If you have the later AW4416A with the IDE optical drive, the early ones had the SCSI drive, and this is not that. This is a later A version with the ATAPI IDE protocol optical drive. What I would recommend with this is really get a hold of as much of it as you can. I will admit I pre-removed this earlier because I knew I wouldn't want to be doing it necessarily with one hand. Normally you would want to get both hands in there, one side pinching as much of the wiring with that side and your other hand pinching the other. And again, just gently kind of rocking back and forth until it comes free. It looks like that standard IDE connector. All right, so in the next step, in the next segment, we're going to work on unfastening the power supply option slot and hard drive bay chassis, and then flipping that over, accessing everything that's underneath. All right, so we have removed our bottom cover. We have moved our optical drive out of the way. We've prepared removal of some of the connections, the drive connector from the main system board. We've removed our connections from the power supply. And by the way, I did verify, so if you also do remove this connector from here for the hard drive and remove this screw and this screw, then this cover simply slides back and lifts off, and that's how you access the power supply itself and access the hardware for the fan if you want to remove the fan, as well as the connector to replace the fan if you want to get a quieter fan, or if you just need to replace it because it's getting noisy or whatever. All right. So in this next step, again, we are unfastening this section of the AW that contains option slot 1, option slot 2, the hard drive bay, and the power supply. We're unfastening that from the chassis with 5 screws. There's one here back in this corner. There's one tucked up here in between option slot 2 and the hard drive bay. And then similar to the other side, we got one up here in this corner next to the power supply, and then toward the front. So we're going to get those 5 screws out, and then we'll work on the next. Okay, so now this whole assembly is free. Oh, and let me mention, you might have noticed my ground clip for the AW, I've moved it from here over to this corner. That's because that just makes it easier as we're flipping this over. I verified that the main system board, one of the mounting screws, if you look closely, you can see the bare copper. So one of the mounting screws bonds the ground plane of the main system board. That's these more broad areas of trace all around. Bonds that to the chassis. So we can clip anywhere to the chassis at this point. I obviously couldn't do this before because the bottom cover was covering that, but now that that's exposed, I've just moved it over to right here at the leading edge of this part of the chassis and used my digital multimeter to verify 0 ohms from the clip to this bared copper area. So I know that we're grounded to the chassis and definitely grounded to the system board. You don't necessarily have to verify with an ohm meter. It's never a bad idea, but just letting you know I did that. The other little thing that we need to do, there is a small black zip tie that holds this large ferrite bead and a bunch of the wire harnessing to this chassis, sub-chassis that we're going to flip over. And I have found it is a lot easier just to cut that zip tie and free that bead and wiring. And I generally leave the zip tie in there to remind me to put a new one in. You can get these, small zip ties at any hardware store. But you'll see it, if we don't do that, you can't really get this flipped over all the way. The other thing that we're going to do, I mentioned earlier I don't have a large rubber mat to go on my work surface. I do have this smaller one that I use when working on doing board level work that's out of a device. So this is a thick silicone rubber high temp ESD safe mat. Got that off of Amazon too. I'll put a link in the description for that. And then also some non-conductive, just padded shelf liner, just to protect this stuff as I flip this over. And I also forgot to mention, if you're going to remove your system board assembly and ship it to somebody, you must either have on hand or purchase an ESD safe plastic bag to put that in for shipping. I can't recommend that highly enough. And you can get those on Amazon too, but you need a large one. I'll put a link in the description for that also. So I forgot to add that earlier as this tools and supplies that you need. So at any rate, we're now free. We can just take this whole assembly and just flip it right on over and lay it there. We're gonna adjust a little bit so that we don't put too much strain on our wiring. And then, of course, the next step now, since we see that we have our main system board and sub CPU board exposed, it will simply be to unplug anything that interfaces the main system board or the sub CPU board with the rest of the unit. Unplug those things and remove our screws that fasten the main system board to the chassis, and then it lifts free. So we'll do that in our next step. And to prepare for that, again, most of this is pretty logical as you have this sitting here. You know, like there are these two ribbon cables that you're going to unplug, and they're going to sit here if you leave your partially disassembled AW like this. These things are going to be like this. You're not going to be able to put this back one in this front one and this front one and this back one, and you're not going to be able to get it to reach anywhere else. So there's some logic and, you know, security in that, but there's nothing wrong with taking a Sharpie and labeling this one and labeling this one, or taking pictures, or doing whatever you need to do, labeling with blue or green painter's tape. Those are some different things that I'll do. But most of this goes back together in the only way it could have come apart. But take pictures, label, whatever you need to do. So we'll start getting into that in the next step. So now we're going to go ahead and actually remove the system board, and there's two things we have to do in order to accomplish that. We have a number of screws that need to be removed, and we also, of course, have a number of connections that need to be removed. And there are about 3 different styles of connections here, and so I want to talk a little bit about those. You know, we have our plug-in connectors, and again, grasp, firmly, gently rock, and pull. That would be the same for these type. We have these ribbon type connectors between the card and hard drive cage and power supply assembly and the main system board. These ribbon cables do simply pull out. I recommend that you do it with 2 hands, pinch one on each side, gently rocking and applying some upward pressure. You'll see that the terminals are on the exposed contacts are on the other side. When reinserting these, the width of the cable is the same as the width of the connector on the motherboard, and so line it up in there. And again, I would recommend you do this with 2 hands, one pinching each side, and just gently rocking and applying that downward pressure, and it'll seat down in there. So that's how those connect. The third type applies to these 4 on this sub CPU board. And if you look close, you'll notice there are actually little ears on these. These ones actually have a release. You want to push that forward. I don't know if you can see that now, but I'm locking it back in. I'm releasing it. You want to release all of these because that is a zero insertion force connection, or a ZIF socket. And so when you're putting these ones back together, again, ensuring that this is out or unlatched so that you can just set the end of the ribbon cable in there and then clamp it in and it's reconnected. You're not necessarily going to damage the contacts on the ribbon cable by pulling it out without releasing it, but you're going to have a really hard time getting it seated back in there and risk damaging. So make sure that you release those. So I'm going to go around and show all of the connections that need to be removed in order to get the main system board and sub CPU assembly removed. And then in the next step, we'll remove the fasteners. Oh, and one thing I forgot to mention early in the video, you do also need to remove all of the knobs for the inputs 1 through 8 trim controls, the headphones level knob, and the monitor out level knob. Those 10 knobs, you need to remove those also. So I did that before I started recording here and just pulled those out. They just slide off, but remove all of those. All right. So here we've got 2 ribbon connectors, and then we've got these 2, and having disconnected this IDE connector earlier and disconnected the power, now that sets this assembly free from the system board. And then we have this ribbon cable connector, and some of these I pre-loosened since I knew that I would be doing it with one hand while filming. So these will come out a little more firmly for you, but again, just grasping all of the wires, gently rocking and pulling it free. So this one, this one, this one. And again, notice how they're lined out, and they all have different connectors. They can only go back in one way, but again, label, take pictures, whatever you need to do. And then this ribbon cable, this one, and this one all need to be disconnected. I'm releasing the locking mechanism for all of those. Okay, that's done. And once those are all released, these 3, these 4, this set of 2, and this set of 2, the system board is now disconnected. And in the next step, we will remove the screws and actually be able to lift the system board assembly free. And I missed a couple of things. You also need to disconnect this green connector from the system board. That goes back to, I believe it goes back to the fader assembly, or maybe up to the display assembly. But that's right here. Disconnect that. And also this goes back to the fader assembly. This is that bundle of 3 from the power supply connector. You just need to unwind that from this bundle, and then it's free. Now the system board is disconnected and ready to be removed after we remove the screws, which we'll do next. All right, so now that we've got all of the connections removed from the main system board and sub CPU assembly, we're going to go ahead and remove all of the screws that fasten the assembly to the main chassis. And I've pre-loosened these just to make it easier for me to remove them and get them two sets of screws, really. There's a set of screws that fastens the main system board itself to the main chassis, and then there's a set of screws that fasten the sub chassis to the main chassis, and that's this U-shaped channel along the back plane to which all of the jacks are mounted. And so that itself is also mounted to the main chassis. And so you have to remove both of those sets of screws. And I'll show you where they are. There are a total of 7 that mount the system board itself to the main chassis, and then there's a total of 5 that mount this sub chassis to the main chassis. So we've got a set of 3 of them toward the physical front of the machine. We've got one here. There is one hiding right here. And then we've got one over here. And then along the, toward the physical rear of the machine, there's a set of 4. There's one here. There's an access hole through the sub CPU board to get to number 2. Another access hole through sub CPU to get to number 3, and then here's number 4 along the side. So let's remove those, and then we'll take a look at the 5 screws that mount the sub chassis to the main chassis. All right. So now that those 7 screws are out, let's look at the 5 screws that fasten the sub chassis to the main chassis. And once those are free, the entire assembly can be lifted out. So we've got a set of 3 along the back down below here. We've got one here, and then we've got an access hole through both the sub CPU assembly and main board down to number 2 there, and then number 3 over here. And then there are 2 along the back plane. We've got one here and one right there. So let's remove those. All right, and now that we've got all of our connections disconnected, all of our screws removed, we've removed our knobs from the control surface, you can now slide it forward and I have to lift up and loosen it a little bit around, and then just gently slide it forward, and that gets the jacks clear of the backplane panel. The BNC connectors for your word clock connections are going to be the ones that are a little kind of the most difficult to clear, but just by lifting up and pulling forward slightly, you can get those to clear, and then the whole assembly is able to just be lifted straight out of the machine. And there you have it. And I'm just going to gently rest this here just to show you something. If you wanted to send just the main board, I have people that get to this stage and just send this aggregate assembly with the main board, the sub CPU, and this sub chassis, and that's perfectly fine. If for some reason you wanted to break it down a little bit further, to remove this sub chassis from the boards, or remove the boards from the sub chassis, you have to remove the screws on the XLR jacks, remove this screw from these RCA jacks, this screw from this, here, remove these clips, and it comes free. And then disconnect the sub CPU board from the main board here and here. Don't try and remove them here. These are not connectorized. Disconnect from the main board, this connector, and then unwrap this strain relief here. And then you can take that all apart. So there you go. There are a lot of steps involved, and it might seem overwhelming, but we can just break it down into, basically we removed the bottom cover, we took this chassis and disconnected it, unfastened it, and flipped it back, and then removed the main board assembly, and we just break it down into those chunks. And the other thing to keep in mind, if you feel intimidated about doing this, as long as you're using proper electrostatic discharge measures, and taking some care to be just careful and thoughtful in your approach, you are disassembling something that was designed to be disassembled. In a lot of consumer grade equipment, you don't have connections that are connectorized, that you can unplug. You find things that are riveted that might have to be drilled out instead of just unscrewed. This device was designed to be able to be disassembled into separate major components, serviced, repaired, what have you. So it's really all in just taking a careful approach, knowing what you're doing, and taking some steps so that you can, get it put back together. But it really is doable if you're taking those particular precautions. So at any rate, I appreciate you watching. I hope this is helpful. I am a better hobby technician and better drummer than I am a videographer. So thanks for your patience with some very amateur camera work. If you enjoyed the video, or if it's helpful, please consider subscribing to my channel. Please feel free to post questions, feedback, comments. I'm always open and responsive to that, and I appreciate you watching. And again, hopefully it was helpful. So thanks for watching.